Stay down there until you learn respect." Those were the last words I heard before my father's hands hit my back and I tumbled down 15 basement stairs. I landed hard on the concrete floor. My body crumpled in the darkness, and I didn't move. Not because I couldn't, but because I'd been planning this moment for 3 months. In my pocket, a voice recorder had captured every scream, every threat, every second of what Kenneth Hartley thought was just another lesson for his disobedient daughter. That night, lying still in the cold basement with my hand pressed against the recorder, I learned something my father never understood. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't strength, it's silence. My name is Rachel, and this is a story of how a basement floor and a hidden recording taught my father that respect isn't beaten into someone, it's earned, and he was about to lose all of mine. Before I tell you how a 15-stair fall changed our family forever, subscribe and share this story with someone who knows what it's like to survive in silence. And please, comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I love connecting with survivors from all over the world. What happened that night in the basement taught me that sometimes staying down is the bravest way to finally stand up. 3 months before that night in the basement, I stood in the electronics section of a Best Buy in downtown Akron, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the small voice recorder I'd been staring at for 20 minutes. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, that sterile buzz that makes everything feel both too bright and too distant at the same time, and I remember thinking how strange it was that I was shopping for the device that might save my life the same way someone else might shop for headphones or a phone charger. The recorder was small, about the size of a pack of gum, black and sleek with a tiny red button that would start recording with just one press. I picked it up, put it down, picked it up again. My palms were sweating. A saleswoman in a blue polo shirt approached me twice asking if I needed help, and both times I shook my head and pretended to be comparing prices on my phone. But really I was just trying to control my breathing because every time I looked at that little device I saw my father's face and heard his voice screaming in my head. How do you prepare for your own fall? How do you walk into a store knowing that the tiny piece of technology in your hand might be the only thing standing between you and another decade of terror? I didn't have answers to those questions that day. All I knew was that 2 weeks earlier, my father had thrown a dinner plate at my head because I'd forgotten to pick up his dry cleaning, and when I'd driven myself to the ER with blood running down my temple, I told the nurse I'd slipped in the shower. Again. It was the 4th time in 2 years I'd used that excuse, and I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe me, but what could she do? I was 28 years old, I lived in my father's house because I couldn't afford to leave, and every time I thought about escaping I remembered that Kenneth Hartley wasn't the kind of man who let go of control easily. So instead of leaving, I bought a voice recorder for $49.99. I paid in cash because I didn't want it showing up on any bank statements he might see, and I tucked the receipt deep into my purse where he'd never find it. The whole drive home, that small box sat in the passenger seat like a bomb, and I kept glancing at it at red lights, wondering if I was brave enough to actually use it or if I was just fooling myself into thinking I had any power left. When I pulled into our driveway, I sat in my car for 10 extra minutes, holding that box in my lap, feeling the weight of what it represented. This wasn't just a recording device. This was evidence. This was proof. This was me finally admitting to myself that what happened in our house wasn't normal, wasn't okay, wasn't something I deserved no matter how many times my father told me I brought it on myself. I opened the box right there in the car, pulled out the recorder, and pressed the red button just to hear the tiny beep that meant it was working. Then I pressed it again to stop. Beep. On. Beep. Off. Such a simple sound, but it felt like the loudest thing I'd ever heard. That night, I hid the recorder in my bedroom, tucked inside an old jewelry box my mother had left behind before she disappeared 7 years ago, and I made a decision that changed everything. I would document it all. Every scream, every threat, every moment of violence. I would carry that recorder in my pocket every single day, and I would wait for the moment when my father's rage would finally give me the evidence I needed. Not to send him to prison, not even to make him stop, but just to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't making it up, that the fear I lived with every single day was real and justified and not my fault. 3 months. That's how long I waited. 3 months of walking around my own home with a recorder in my pocket, my finger always ready to press that red button. 3 months of conversations at dinner where he'd criticize everything I did while I sat there nodding and agreeing. knowing that if he escalated, if he crossed that line again, I'd have proof. And the strangest thing was that carrying that recorder made me braver. Not brave enough to leave, not yet, but brave enough to stop apologizing for things that weren't my fault. Brave enough to meet his eyes when he yelled instead of staring at the floor. Brave enough to finally understand that survival sometimes means planning your own fall before someone else pushes you. Kenneth Hartley wasn't always a monster. That's the part that makes this whole story so much harder to tell, because it would be easier if I could say he was born violent, that he came into the world with clenched fists and a taste for cruelty. But the truth is that when I was 7 years old, my father was the man who taught me how to ride a bike in the park on Saturday mornings, running beside me with his hand on the seat until I found my balance. And when I finally pedaled away on my own, he stood there clapping like I'd just won an Olympic medal. I remember the exact color of that bike, bubblegum pink with white streamers on the handlebars, and I remember how safe I felt knowing he was right there behind me. Back then, his presence meant protection, not danger. The house we lived in was a modest 2-story colonial on Maple Street, the kind of neighborhood where everyone mowed their lawns on Sundays and waved to each other from their porches, and for a while we looked like every other family on the block. My mother would garden in the front yard, planting tulips that bloomed every spring in perfect rows of red and yellow, and my father would sit on the porch steps after work, still wearing his factory supervisor uniform, drinking sweet tea and reading the Akron Beacon Journal. He'd call me over sometimes, pull me onto his lap, even though I was getting too big for it, and quiz me on current events like I was his little genius in training. What's the capital of Montana, Rachel? Who's the vice president? How many innings in a baseball game? I'd answer as fast as I could, desperate for his approval, and when I got something right, his whole face would light up with this pride that made me feel like I was the most important person in the world. But there were cracks even then, tiny fissures I didn't have the language to name. He had rules, so many rules, about how things should be done in his house. Shoes off at the door, no exceptions. Dinner at 6 sharp, everyone seated before he arrived at the table. Homework finished before any television, and even then only shows he approved of, nothing he deemed too violent or too stupid or too whatever arbitrary standard he'd invented that week. My mother moved through the house like a dancer who'd memorized every step, anticipating his needs before he voiced them, and I learned early to read his moods by the sound of his footsteps coming up the walkway. Heavy and slow meant a bad day at the factory. Quick and light meant he was in a good mood. Anything in between required careful navigation. The first time I saw real anger in him, I was 9. My mother had bought a new brand of coffee without asking him first, some organic blend from the grocery store that cost $3 more than his usual Folgers, and I watched from the kitchen doorway as he held up the bag and asked her in this terrifyingly calm voice if she thought money grew on trees. She apologized immediately, said she thought he might like to try something different, but he was already launching into a lecture about fiscal responsibility and respecting the man of the house, and did she think he worked 50 hours a week at the factory just so she could throw his money away on fancy coffee? His voice never rose above conversational volume, but there was something in his eyes that made my stomach twist. My mother returned the coffee the next day. After that, the rules multiplied like bacteria. Don't touch the thermostat. Dad controls the temperature. Don't move anything on his desk. Everything has its place. Don't interrupt when he's watching the news. Don't ask for things we can't afford. Don't embarrass him in front of neighbors. Don't. And the consequences for breaking these rules started small, just verbal corrections and disappointed sighs, but they grew teeth over the years. By the time I was 12, a broken rule meant standing in the corner for an hour. By 15, it meant being grounded for weeks. And somewhere between my 16th birthday and my mother's disappearance when I was 21, the punishment stopped being just emotional and started leaving marks I had to hide under long sleeves. The father who taught me to ride a bike didn't vanish overnight. He eroded slowly, like a cliff face worn down by years of waves, until one day I looked at him and couldn't find any trace of the man who used to clap when I found my balance. What I found instead was someone who needed control the way other people need oxygen, and I was just one more thing in his house that refused to stay exactly where he put it. The first time my father hit me hard enough to leave a bruise that lasted 2 weeks, I was 17, and I'd forgotten to lock the front door before going to bed. It was January, One of those brutal Ohio winters where the cold seeps into your bones and stays there, and I'd come home late from my shift at the diner where I worked weekends to save money for college. I was exhausted, smelling like grease and burnt coffee, and all I wanted was to collapse into bed. I checked the lock, I swear I did, but maybe I was too tired to turn the deadbolt all the way, or maybe my frozen fingers didn't grip it properly. Whatever the reason, at 2 a.m. my father discovered the unlocked door during one of his insomniac patrols of the house, and he came into my bedroom like a storm breaking through a window. I woke up to his hand gripping my shoulder, shaking me so violently my head snapped back against the headboard. The lamp was on suddenly, blinding me, and he was yelling about criminals and home invasions, and did I want us all murdered in our sleep because of my carelessness? Before I could form words to apologize, his open palm connected with my cheek, so hard I tasted copper. The sound echoed in my small bedroom, sharp as a branch cracking, and for a moment we both froze. He'd never done that before. Yelled, yes. Punished, absolutely. But actual physical violence? This was new territory, and I could see in his face that he was surprised too, like his hand had moved independently of his brain. Then something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like justification, and he said in this cold, measured tone that maybe now I'd remember to check the damn locks. He left my room, closed the door quietly behind him, and I sat there in bed, my hand pressed against my burning cheek, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. But the next morning when I looked in the mirror, there it was, a perfect handprint blooming purple and yellow across my face, his fingerprints visible like a signature. I called in sick to school and stayed in my room until the swelling went down. When did fear become my daily language? I think it was that morning, staring at my reflection, realizing that the rules had fundamentally changed and I hadn't been given the updated manual. Because after that night, violence became just another tool in his arsenal, deployed with the same casual frequency as his lectures or his silent treatments. A shove here, a grab there, always justified by whatever transgression I'd committed. Left dishes in the sink overnight, he'd sweep them onto the floor and make me clean them up on my hands and knees while he watched. Came home 15 minutes past curfew. He'd lock me out of the house for 3 hours in the rain until I learned punctuality. Questioned one of his decisions. His hand would shoot out faster than I could flinch, sometimes hitting target, sometimes just creating enough wind to make me stumble backward. And the worst part wasn't the physical pain, though that was real and constant and left me calculating the healing time of bruises like a doctor studying x-rays. The worst part was how quickly it all became normal. I learned to gauge his moods by the set of his jaw at breakfast. I developed a sixth sense for when to make myself invisible, slipping into my bedroom before he found something to criticize. I started wearing my diner uniform, even on days I wasn't working because the long sleeves covered the fingerprint bruises on my upper arms. At school, when teachers asked about the occasional split lip or the time I showed up with a black eye, I became an expert storyteller. Slipped on ice, walked into a cabinet, played volleyball without knee pads. The lies came so easily it scared me. My friends stopped inviting me out because I always said no. Not because I didn't want to go, but because the thought of my father discovering I'd chosen social life over his approval made my chest tighten with panic. College applications sat half-finished on my desk because he decided community college was good enough and anything else was me getting above my raising. I stopped talking about my dreams of studying psychology in California. I stopped talking about dreams, period. By the time I turned 20, I'd learned to make myself so small and quiet that sometimes I'd catch my reflection in a window and not recognize the ghost staring back. The house on Maple Street looked the same from the outside. Tulips still blooming every spring in their perfect rows. Lawn still mowed every Sunday. But inside, we lived in a minefield where any step could trigger an explosion, and I'd become so skilled at tiptoeing through the danger that I'd forgotten what it felt like to walk with my full weight on the ground. Fear wasn't just something I felt anymore. It was the language I spoke, the air I breathed, the lens through which I interpreted every interaction. And the most terrifying part was that I'd started to believe him when he said I deserved it, that I was too sensitive, too careless, too much of a disappointment to warrant anything gentler than his fists. My mother left on a Tuesday morning in March when I was 21 years old. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't leave a note explaining where she was going or why, or if she'd ever come back. What she left instead was a jewelry box on my bed, The same one I'd later hide my voice recorder in, and inside it was her grandmother's pearl necklace wrapped in tissue paper alongside a folded piece of notebook paper with just 7 words written in her careful cursive handwriting. Your father's rage will destroy you too. I found it at noon when I came home from my morning classes at community college, and the house felt wrong the moment I walked through the door. Too quiet. The kind of silence that has weight to it, like the air after a thunderstorm when everything is holding its breath. Her car was gone from the driveway. Her closet was half empty, all the practical clothes taken, and the fancy dresses she never wore left hanging like ghosts. In the bathroom, her toothbrush was missing from the holder, but her expensive face cream sat untouched on the counter, which told me she'd left in a hurry, taking only what mattered. I stood in their bedroom for 20 minutes, holding that note, reading those 7 words over and over until they stopped making sense. Part of me wanted to call her cell phone, but I knew she wouldn't answer. Part of me wanted to wait for my father to come home from the factory and demand answers, but I knew he wouldn't have any, or worse, he'd have too many, and they'd all be my fault somehow. So instead I sat on the edge of her bed, and I let myself remember the conversation we'd had 3 weeks earlier, the one that should have warned me this was coming. We'd been doing dishes together after dinner, my father already in the living room watching the evening news, and she turned to me with this look in her eyes I'd never seen before. Tired didn't cover it. This was exhaustion that lived in the bones, the kind that sleep couldn't fix. She'd asked me in a whisper if I'd ever thought about leaving, about going somewhere he couldn't find me, and I'd laughed because I thought she was joking. Where would I go, Mom? I'd said, I barely make minimum wage at the diner. But she hadn't laughed back. She just squeezed my hand so tight it hurt and said something I didn't understand until I was holding her goodbye note. Some cages look like homes until you realize the doors have been locked from the outside. My mother was 46 when she disappeared. She'd met my father when she was 19, married him at 20, had me at 25. That meant she'd spent 27 years in his shadow, 27 years, learning the same fear I was learning, perfecting the same survival skills. I wondered sometimes if she saw herself in me during those final weeks, if watching me flinch at his footsteps was like looking in a mirror that showed her own past. The police filed a missing persons report because my father insisted, but she wasn't really missing. She was gone, which is different. Missing implies someone wants to be found. Gone means they've made a choice, and you have to respect it even when it breaks your heart. The detective assigned to our case was kind but realistic. Ma'am, he'd said to me during the interview, if your mother emptied her bank account and took her car and left a note, that's not a missing person. That's someone exercising their right to leave. Had she seemed depressed? Suicidal? No and no. She'd seemed determined, which the detective said was actually a good sign, meant she had a plan and wasn't acting impulsively. My father raged for weeks. How dare she abandon her family, embarrass him in front of the neighbors, throw away their marriage like it meant nothing. He turned her absence into another rule I had to follow. We didn't talk about her, didn't mention her name, pretended she'd never existed except when he needed someone to blame for the unmade dinners and the unwashed laundry that suddenly became my responsibility. And here's what I learned in the 7 years between her disappearance and that night in the basement. My mother wasn't weak for leaving. She was the bravest person I'd ever known, because she looked at the rest of her life stretching out in front of her and decided she'd rather lose everything, including me, than spend one more day living in fear. But she'd also made a choice that left me alone with him, and I carried that abandonment like a stone in my chest, never quite forgiving her but also never quite blaming her because how could I? I understood exactly why she ran. What I couldn't understand was why she didn't take me with her. That note, those 7 words, they weren't just a warning. They were permission, a generational truth passed down like the pearl necklace. His rage had driven her away, and if I stayed, it would destroy me too. She'd known. She'd survived, and she'd left me the roadmap written in her careful handwriting, hoping I'd be smart enough to follow it before it was too late. After my mother left, the house transformed into something else entirely. Not overnight, but gradually, like watching a photograph fade in sunlight until the colors disappear and you're left with something gray and unrecognizable. I became the sole target of Kenneth Hartley's need for control, and without my mother there to absorb half the impact, every bit of his rage landed squarely on me. I was 21 when she disappeared. By 28, I'd learned to move through our home like a prisoner memorizing guard rotations, always calculating risk, always prepared for the next explosion. The kitchen became a battlefield. He'd demand specific meals cooked to exact specifications, roast beef at precisely medium rare, potatoes with skins on never off, green beans that still had snap but weren't raw. I'd stand at the stove with a meat thermometer in one hand and a timer in the other, my shoulders tense because I knew that even 1 degree too hot or 1 minute too long would result in the plate being hurled across the room. I got good at dodging flying dishes. The wall behind the kitchen table had a permanent dent from where a ceramic bowl had shattered 3 years ago, and I'd never repaired it because what was the point? There'd just be another one. The smell of scorched meat became my most frequent perfume, that acrid burning scent that clung to my hair and clothes because I was so terrified of undercooking anything that I often went too far the other direction. On Thursday nights, he wanted pot roast like his mother used to make, and I must have attempted that recipe 50 times, but it was never right. Too dry, too tough, too much salt, not enough time. Once, after I'd spent 4 hours cooking what I thought was a perfect meal, he took one bite, stood up without a word, and swept the entire dinner onto the floor. Meat, potatoes, carrots, gravy, all of it landing in a heap on the linoleum while I stood there with serving spoons still in my hands. "Clean it up," he'd said, and then made himself a sandwich while I got on my knees with paper towels and garbage bags, crying so hard I could barely see what I was picking up. The living room was his kingdom. I wasn't allowed to sit in his recliner, change the channel, or make any noise while he watched television. I'd perch on the edge of the couch doing homework or scrolling through my phone with the sound off, barely breathing, because any disturbance could trigger a lecture that lasted hours. He paused his show, turned to face me, and deliver monologues about my failures, how I'd never amount to anything, how I was wasting his money on a useless degree, how I should be grateful he allowed me to live under his roof when most fathers would have kicked out such an ungrateful daughter years ago. Sometimes these lectures were just verbal. Sometimes they escalated. I learned to read the warning signs in his body language, the way his jaw would clench before his hand would move, but even when I saw it coming, I couldn't always get out of range fast enough. My bedroom was supposed to be safe, but he'd taken the lock off my door when I was 16, said privacy was a privilege I hadn't earned. He'd come in at random times, sometimes to inspect whether I'd cleaned properly, running his finger along surfaces checking for dust. Other times just to loom in the doorway watching me, making sure I knew he could enter my space whenever he wanted, that nothing in his house belonged to me, not even the 6 feet by 8 feet where I slept. I started keeping my important things in my car. My laptop, my textbooks, the small amount of money I managed to save from the diner. Anything I truly valued couldn't stay in the house because he'd proven time and again that he'd destroy whatever I cared about if it served his purpose. The bathroom medicine cabinet told the story better than any diary could. Band-Aids in 3 different sizes, gauze pads, medical tape, antibiotic ointment, ibuprofen in the extra-strength bottle that I refilled monthly, concealer in 2 shades darker than my actual skin tone, the kind makeup artists use to cover tattoos, because regular foundation didn't hide the bruises well enough. I'd stand at the mirror every morning creating a face that looked normal enough to go out into the world, painting over split lips and black eyes and fingerprint marks. And I became so skilled at this daily transformation that sometimes I'd forget what I actually looked like underneath all the cover-up. The garage was where the worst incidents happened, away from windows where neighbors might see. He'd call me out there under the pretense of helping him with some project, and then find fault with how I was holding a tool or standing in his way. The concrete floor was unforgiving when I fell. I knew exactly how cold that ground felt against my cheek, how the oil stains smelled up close, how long it took for the room to stop spinning after my head hit the workbench. But I'd pull myself up, dust off my jeans, and go back inside like nothing had happened because what else was there to do? Call the police and tell them what? That my father, who'd never been arrested, who was respected at his factory job, who smiled at neighbors and paid his taxes on time, was violent behind closed doors? I tried that once when I was 23. The officers had come, taken statements, looked at the bruise on my arm that was already yellowing and therefore not convincing. My father had been calm and reasonable, explained that we'd had a disagreement and things got heated but it was just family stuff. You know how daughters can be dramatic. They'd left after 10 minutes, And the moment their car pulled away, he'd made me pay for that phone call in ways that taught me never to dial 911 again. So I stopped trying to leave, stopped dreaming about California and psychology degrees, stopped answering calls from old friends who'd moved on to normal lives with normal problems. I existed in a state of perpetual survival mode, my entire life reduced to avoiding triggers and minimizing damage. 7 years of this, from 21 to 28. 7 years of tiptoeing through landmines. 7 years of wondering if this was just how life was going to be forever, if I'd still be here at 40, at 50, at 60, until one of us died and finally set the other free. For 3 months I carried that voice recorder everywhere, and it changed the way I inhabited my own body. The device lived in my right front pocket, always, a small rectangular presence that weighed less than 2 ounces but felt heavy as a stone. I'd wake up every morning and transfer it from my nightstand to whatever pants I was wearing, checking twice that the battery was charged, that the memory card had space, that the microphone wasn't blocked by lint or fabric. Then I'd go about my day with one hand constantly drifting to that pocket, fingers brushing against the smooth plastic surface, reassuring myself it was still there. Ready. Waiting. The first week was pure anxiety. Every time my father walked into a room, I'd feel that recorder burning through my jeans like a hot coal, certain he could somehow sense its presence, that he'd demand to know what was in my pocket and discover my plan before I could execute it. I practiced reaching for the record button without looking, sitting at red lights with my hand in my pocket, pressing down with my thumb until I could find that little button blind. Click! The sound was barely audible, just a soft mechanical whisper, but I heard it like a gunshot. I must have pressed that button 100 times in empty rooms, testing myself, making sure that when the moment came I wouldn't fumble or hesitate or accidentally hit the wrong control. Breakfast on day 8, he started yelling about the eggs being too runny. My thumb found the button. Click. Recording. I sat there eating toast while he ranted about my incompetence, and the whole time I was thinking this is it, this is evidence, but then he just finished his coffee and left for work without escalating. I stopped the recording feeling both relieved and disappointed, a strange combination that became familiar over the following weeks. Day 15, he shoved me into the wall because I'd left the porch light on all night wasting electricity. Click. Recording. But it was over in seconds, just a brief moment of violence followed by him walking away, and when I played it back later the audio was mostly just the thud of my body hitting drywall and my sharp intake of breath. Not enough. Not convincing. Day 23, he grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks, his fingers digging into my bicep while he lectured me about tracking mud into the house. Click. Recording. 3 minutes of his voice, cold and measured, telling me I was careless and stupid and thoughtless. Good audio. Clear. But was it enough? Would anyone listening understand the fear in my silence, the way I held perfectly still because moving would make it worse? Day 37, he swept a week's worth of mail off the kitchen counter because I'd opened an envelope addressed to him, something about a bill I was trying to help with. The envelopes scattered across the floor like snow, and he stood over me while I gathered them, telling me I had no right to touch his personal business. Click. Recording. But again, just words. Just anger. Nothing that would make someone listening understand the years of context behind those words. I started to wonder if I was wasting my time, if I'd ever capture the moment that would justify the risk I was taking by documenting any of this. What was I hoping for exactly? Video evidence didn't exist in my pocket. I couldn't prove the bruises came from him. All I had was audio of a father yelling at his adult daughter. And didn't fathers yell? Wasn't that just normal family conflict to anyone who didn't live inside our particular nightmare? But I kept the recorder anyway, charged it every night, carried it every day, and somewhere around week 7 something shifted in me. The act of having that device, of knowing I was documenting the abuse, even when the recordings weren't dramatic enough to matter, made me feel less powerless. I started meeting his eyes during his lectures instead of staring at my shoes. Started saying, okay, instead of I'm sorry, when he criticized me. Small rebellions, barely noticeable, but they were there. He noticed. I could see it in the way he looked at me sometimes, confused by the subtle change in my demeanor, like I was a dog that had suddenly stopped cowering and he wasn't sure what it meant. On day 73, he asked me why I seemed different lately, Was I taking drugs? Was I seeing some boy who was putting ideas in my head? I told him I was just tired from work and school. He stared at me for a long moment, and I kept my hand away from my pocket, forced myself not to reach for that recorder, even though every instinct screamed to grab it. If he discovered it now, before I had the evidence I needed, everything would be for nothing. He'd destroy it, destroy me for the betrayal. The confrontation would come early, and I wouldn't be ready. So I held still and met his stare, and waited until he finally grunted and turned away. That night I sat on my bedroom floor and listened to all 73 days of recordings, hours and hours of my father's voice interspersed with silence, with the sounds of dishes breaking and doors slamming and my own breathing. 3 months of evidence, and I realized that I wasn't just collecting proof anymore. I was building a timeline, documenting the pattern, creating an archive that showed this wasn't isolated incidents but a sustained campaign of control and violence. Day 89, which would turn out to be 3 days before the basement, I checked the recorder's memory and saw I had room for approximately 4 more hours of audio. Enough for what was coming, though I didn't know that yet. I just knew that something was building between us, some final confrontation that felt inevitable, like watching storm clouds gather and knowing you're about to get soaked but being unable to find shelter. I recharged the battery to full, made sure the microphone was unobstructed, slipped it into my pocket, and felt its familiar weight settle against my hip. 3 months of carrying the small device, 3 months of my thumb knowing exactly where the record button was, 3 months of transforming fear into preparation. I didn't know that in 3 days I'd be lying at the bottom of basement stairs with that recorder still running in my pocket. Didn't know that my careful planning was about to meet its moment. All I knew was that I was ready, or as ready as anyone can be when they're preparing to document their own destruction in hopes of finally stopping it. It started because I came home 20 minutes late from my shift at the diner. 20 minutes. I'd stopped at the grocery store to pick up the specific brand of bread he liked, the one they only stocked on Saturdays, because I'd noticed we were running low and I thought maybe, just maybe, if I got ahead of his needs, he'd have one less thing to criticize. Instead, those 20 minutes became the excuse he'd been waiting for. He was standing in the kitchen when I walked through the door, arms crossed, watching the clock on the microwave like it was counting down to an execution. "Where were you?" he said. Not asked, and I started explaining about the bread, holding up the bag like evidence of my good intentions, but he cut me off mid-sentence. "You think I'm stupid, Rachel? You think I don't know you were probably out with some guy, embarrassing me, acting like a whore?" The words hit before his hands did, and I felt my face flush with the unfairness of it, the impossibility of winning. 7 years of walking on eggshells, 7 years of trying to anticipate his every need, and still I couldn't get it right. Something in me snapped. Not dramatically, not with shouting, just a quiet break like a thread pulled too tight. I heard myself say, in a voice that didn't sound like mine, that I wasn't doing anything wrong and he knew it. That I'd been at work and then the store and I was tired and could we please just have dinner and not do this tonight. My hand was already in my pocket. Thumb on the button. Click. The recorder came alive and I felt it happen, that tiny mechanical engagement that meant everything he said next would be preserved. His face transformed. That's what it looked like. An actual physical transformation, his features rearranging themselves into something uglier than I'd ever seen. "You don't tell me what we're doing tonight," he said, moving toward me, and I backed up instinctively, still holding that stupid bag of bread. "You don't get to be tired in my house. You don't get to talk back. You don't get to." He was backing me toward the basement door. I didn't even realize it at first, too focused on his face, on the way his hands were flexing at his sides. The basement was off the kitchen, just a wooden door that led to concrete stairs, 15 steps down to a space we barely used except for storage and laundry. I'd done laundry down there 1,000 times, carried baskets up and down those stairs without thinking, but now as my shoulders hit the door I suddenly understood where this was going. "Dad," I said, and I heard the fear creep back into my voice, the old pattern reasserting itself. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean." "Don't," he interrupted. "Don't apologize now. You had your chance to be respectful." The basement door swung open behind me, and I grabbed for the frame, fingers scrabbling for purchase, but he was already moving forward. His hands came up, and I saw them coming but couldn't stop them, both palms flat against my chest, and he shoved hard. "Stay down there until you learn respect," he screamed, and then I was falling backward into empty air. 15 stairs. I counted them on the way down, or maybe my body counted them because each impact registered distinctly. Shoulder blades against edge, spine hitting corner, elbow cracking against wood, hip slamming rail, knee twisting wrong, head bouncing off cement wall. The sounds were worse than the pain, these awful thuds and cracks that echoed in the enclosed stairwell, and somewhere in the chaos my hand stayed pressed against my pocket, protecting the recorder, making sure it didn't fly out, making sure it kept recording every second of this. The concrete floor at the bottom rushed up to meet me, and I hit it face first, my cheek slamming into the cold ground, so hard I tasted blood immediately, felt my teeth cut into my tongue. The impact knocked the air from my lungs, and for a few seconds I genuinely couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't do anything except lie there gasping like a fish on a dock, while pain bloomed everywhere simultaneously. My ribs screamed. My head throbbed. Something in my left arm felt wrong, not broken but damaged. Blood ran from my nose. I could feel it pooling warm against the concrete, and my vision swam with bright spots that might have been stars or might have been my brain misfiring from the trauma. Above me, I heard the basement door slam shut, heard the lock click, heard his footsteps retreat into the kitchen, and then silence. Complete silence except for my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of the water heater in the corner. I lay there on that freezing concrete, my body screaming at me to move, to check for serious damage, to get up and find my phone and call for help. But I didn't move. This is where the planning took over, where 3 months of carrying that recorder and preparing for this moment crystallized into absolute clarity. If I got up now, if I showed him I was okay, this would just be another incident in a long line of incidents. Another time he hurt me and got away with it. Another story I'd tell myself about how I deserved it somehow. But if I stayed down, if I played dead, if I let him wonder whether this time he'd gone too far, whether this time there would be consequences he couldn't talk his way out of. My hand found my pocket. The recorder was still there, still running. I could feel it warm against my hip, capturing everything. My labored breathing, the sound of blood dripping onto concrete, the absolute silence of a basement that might contain a corpse. How much pain is enough to fight back? I'd asked myself that question so many times over the years, and I'd never had an answer because every threshold I set would get crossed, and I'd survive it and reset the bar higher. But lying there at the bottom of those stairs, tasting blood and feeling bones complain, I finally understood that the question was wrong. It wasn't about how much pain was enough. It was about what I was willing to use. And right now, in this moment, I had everything I needed. A recording of my father pushing me down the stairs. His exact words, the sounds of my body hitting every step, and the willingness to stay perfectly still in my own blood until he came down to check whether he'd killed his daughter. So I didn't move, didn't call out, just pressed my hand against that recorder in my pocket and waited in the cold basement darkness for Kenneth Hartley to realize that this time his rage had finally crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The basement had one bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, but my father had switched it off before locking the door. So I lay in absolute darkness broken only by a thin line of light seeping under the door at the top of the stairs. My eyes adjusted slowly, shapes emerging from the black, the hulking shadow of the water heater, the geometric outline of storage boxes stacked against the far wall, the dangling silhouettes of old winter coats hanging from hooks. Everything took on a sinister quality in the absence of light, and I had to keep reminding myself that I knew the space, had been down here hundreds of times, that the darkness couldn't hurt me more than I was already hurt. Time moved strangely. I'd lost my phone in the fall, heard it skitter across the concrete somewhere to my left, so I had no way to check how long I'd been lying there. Could have been 5 minutes. Could have been 30. My body wanted to move desperately, every muscle screaming at me to shift position, to relieve the pressure on my bruised ribs, to wipe the blood from my face, but I forced myself to stay absolutely still. This was the performance of my life, and if I broke character now, if he looked down from the top of the stairs and saw me moving, the whole plan would collapse. So I lay there and I counted. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. When I got to 60, I'd start over, and each completed minute felt like a small victory, proof that I could endure this, that my willpower was stronger than my discomfort. The cold seeped up from the concrete, working its way into my bones until I started shivering involuntarily. I tried to control it, But my body had other ideas, small tremors running through my limbs that I couldn't suppress. The shivering actually helped sell the performance, I realized. If he came down and found me shaking and still, it would look even more convincing, like I was going into shock or dying or both. The water heater kicked on with a mechanical groan that made my heart jump, and I listened to it cycle through its routine, the sound of gas igniting and water beginning to circulate. Ordinary sounds. The soundtrack of a house going about its business, while a daughter bled on the basement floor. I wondered what he was doing up there. Was he pacing? Sitting at the kitchen table? Had he gone to his recliner to watch television, trying to pretend nothing had happened? Part of me understood him in a way I hated to acknowledge. He was probably scared. Not scared for me, but scared for himself, scared of what he'd done and what it might mean for his carefully constructed life. Kenneth Hartley, respected factory supervisor, upstanding member of the community, family man. That identity would crumble if anyone found out he'd pushed his daughter down the stairs. The recorder in my pocket had gone warm from being pressed against my body, and I focused on that warmth, used it as an anchor. Evidence. I had evidence. Whatever happened next, whatever story he tried to tell, I had his exact words preserved. Stay down there until you learn respect. And then the sounds of violence, the audio documentation of my body hitting every step. No amount of charm or explanation could erase that recording. My breathing had stabilized, the initial panic giving way to something calmer, more calculated. I ran through scenarios in my mind. When he came down to check on me, because he would eventually, what would I do? Stay completely still. Let him think I was unconscious or worse. Or open my eyes at just the right moment to show him I'd survived, but barely, that I was hurt badly enough to justify everything that would come next? I decided on the latter. I'd wait until he was close, until he'd touched me or called my name, and then I'd open my eyes and I'd look at him, and I'd let him see exactly what his rage had created. A daughter who'd stopped being afraid of him because the worst had already happened. A daughter who'd been planning and preparing and was now ready to dismantle his entire world. Somewhere above me, a floorboard creaked. My pulse quickened. Was he coming? I listened with every ounce of concentration I had, tracking his movements through the house by the sounds filtering down through the ceiling. Footsteps in the kitchen. The refrigerator opening and closing. More footsteps. Then silence again. Not yet. He wasn't ready yet. Still working up the courage to face what he'd done. I used the time to take inventory of my injuries without moving. My nose was definitely bleeding. I could feel the blood drying tacky on my upper lip. My ribs ached with every breath, but nothing felt broken, just badly bruised. The arm that had hit the railing throbbed, but I could flex my fingers, so probably not fractured. My head hurt worst of all, a deep pounding pain that radiated from where I'd bounced off the cement wall, and I made a mental note to tell the EMTs about that, to make sure they checked for concussion. Because there would be EMTs. I'd make sure of that. This basement floor was cold and miserable, and I was lying in my own blood, but it was also the launching pad for everything that came next. Every minute I stayed down here was another minute of him panicking, another minute of him realizing he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. My mother's note floated through my mind. Your father's rage will destroy you too. She'd been right, but not in the way she'd meant. His rage was destroying the version of me who'd been afraid, who'd spent 7 years trying to be small and quiet and good enough to avoid his anger. That Rachel was dying on this basement floor. The one who'd replace her would be different. Harder. Braver. Someone who understood that survival sometimes meant using your own pain as a weapon. Another creak overhead, closer to the basement door this time. My heart hammered against my bruised ribs, and I took a slow breath, forced my body to go even more limp, practiced the vacant stare I'd give him when he finally descended those stairs. He was coming. I could feel it. And I was ready. More ready than I'd ever been for anything in my life. Because this wasn't just about documenting abuse anymore. This was about forcing a man who'd terrorized me for years to finally face consequences, to finally understand that control is just an illusion and the people you hurt eventually hurt you back, even if it's just by refusing to protect you from yourself anymore. The basement door handle rattled. Stay still, I told myself. Don't move. Don't blink. Let him see what his hands created. Let him be afraid. The basement door opened and light flooded down the stairs. a rectangle of yellow illumination that fell across my legs but left my face in shadow. I heard him before I saw him, his breath coming in short, rapid bursts like he'd been running, and when his footsteps started descending those stairs they were slow, hesitant, nothing like the confident heavy tread I'd learned to fear over the years. Each step he took was deliberate, cautious, the movement of someone approaching something they didn't want to see. The wooden stairs creaked under his weight in a rhythm I knew by heart, and I kept my eyes half open, just slits that looked vacant, unseeing, while I tracked his approach through my lashes. He reached the bottom and stood there for what felt like an eternity, and I could see his shoes from my position on the floor, the steel-toed work boots he wore to the factory, scuffed and dusty. They stayed planted 3 feet from my head, not moving closer, and I realized he was afraid to touch me. Kenneth Hartley, who'd spent 7 years using his hands to control me, was now terrified of what those hands might have done. "Rachel," he said, and his voice cracked on my name, splintered into something I'd never heard before. Fear. Actual fear. Not anger, not authority, just pure undiluted terror that he'd killed his daughter in a moment of rage and now had to face the consequences. I didn't respond. Didn't blink. Didn't let my chest rise and fall too obviously. Through my barely open eyes, I watched him shift his weight, saw his hands come up and then drop back to his sides like he didn't know what to do with them. He took 1 step closer, then another, and I could smell him now, that combination of factory machine oil and Old Spice deodorant that I'd been smelling my whole life, but underneath it was something new, sweat, sharp and acrid, the smell of panic. His breathing was loud in the quiet basement, coming in stuttered inhales like he might start crying, and that almost broke my concentration because I'd never heard Kenneth Hartley cry, didn't think he was capable of it. "Rachel," he said again, louder this time, and I heard the desperation in it, the plea for me to wake up and prove he wasn't a murderer. "Please. God, please." I'd never heard him say please before. Never heard him invoke God except when he was angry. This was a different man standing over me, or maybe the same man, stripped of the armor of control, reduced to someone who just realized he destroyed the only family he had left. He knelt down finally, his knees cracking with the movement, and I felt his fingers touch my neck, searching for a pulse. His hands were shaking so badly I could feel the tremor in his fingertips, and he pressed too hard at first, then adjusted, trying to find my carotid artery through his own panic. I let him find it, let him feel my heartbeat, steady and strong, proof that I was alive. He made a sound then, something between a sob and a gasp, and his hand jerked away like my skin had burned him. "You're alive," he whispered, but it didn't sound like relief. It sounded like the beginning of understanding, like some part of his brain was starting to compute that alive meant conscious of what he'd done, meant memory and testimony and consequences. I felt him lean closer, his breath hot on my face, and he must have seen the blood because he muttered something I couldn't quite catch, maybe a curse or maybe a prayer. His hand hovered over my shoulder like he wanted to shake me awake, but was afraid to move me in case something was broken. "Rachel," he said, more firmly now, trying to inject authority back into his voice and failing completely. "Wake up. Can you hear me?" I stayed perfectly still. Let the silence stretch between us. Let him marinate in the terror of not knowing whether I was unconscious or dying or permanently damaged. Let him imagine explaining this to police, to paramedics, to neighbors who'd wonder how a healthy 28-year-old woman ended up at the bottom of a basement staircase. Through my slitted eyes, I watched him stand up and pace, 3 steps toward the water heater and 3 steps back, his hands going to his head, fingers gripping his hair. He was muttering to himself now, a stream of words I couldn't fully make out, but the tone was clear, bargaining, rationalizing, trying to figure out how to fix this. Maybe she just needs a minute to come around. Maybe it looks worse than it is. Maybe if I call an ambulance and say she fell, say it was an accident, say I found her like this. I could hear him constructing the lie in real time, and some part of me almost pitied him because he didn't know yet that lies wouldn't work this time. Didn't know about the recorder in my pocket that had captured every word, every sound, every second of what had really happened. He knelt beside me again, and this time his hand went to my shoulder, not rough but not gentle either, and he shook me slightly. "Come on," he said, and now the fear in his voice was giving way to something else, irritation maybe, or frustration that I wasn't cooperating with his need for me to wake up and tell him everything was fine. Rachel, enough. Stop playing around. Playing around. Like this was some game I'd invented to torture him. Like I'd thrown myself down 15 stairs just to make him feel bad. The audacity of it almost made me open my eyes right then, almost made me sit up and scream at him, but I held on to my performance because I knew the longer I stayed still, the more he'd unravel, the more he'd reveal about who he really was when his control slipped away. He stood up again, and I heard him climb the stairs, fast now, panicked footsteps running up to the kitchen, and for a moment I thought he was leaving, abandoning me down here to deal with this alone. But then he was back, thundering down the stairs with something in his hand, and when he knelt beside me again I felt cold water hit my face, splashing across my cheeks and forehead. He brought a glass from the kitchen, was trying to revive me like I'd fainted from the heat instead of being pushed down concrete stairs. The water ran into my hair, down my neck, and it took every ounce of control not to sputter or flinch or give any sign that it bothered me. "Wake up," he said, and his voice had taken on an edge of anger now, that familiar tone that meant his fear was curdling into rage because I wasn't responding the way he needed me to. "Wake up right now, Rachel. You're scaring me." I'm scaring him. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. 28 years of him scaring me, and now, lying motionless in my own blood on his basement floor, I finally had the power to scare him back. His hand found my wrist, checking my pulse again, and I felt him relax slightly when he found it strong and steady. But that relaxation lasted only seconds before new panic set in, the realization that if I had a pulse but wasn't waking up, something might be seriously wrong. Brain damage, coma, all the terrifying possibilities that came with head trauma. "I need to call someone," he said, talking to himself now, to me, to the empty basement. "I need to call 911. But he didn't move toward the stairs, didn't pull out his phone, just knelt there frozen, and I knew exactly what was stopping him. The moment he called for help, the moment paramedics came into his house and saw his daughter unconscious at the bottom of his basement stairs, he lost control of the narrative. They'd ask questions he couldn't answer honestly. They'd see things he couldn't explain away. His whole carefully constructed life would begin to crumble, and he knew it. So he stayed there, paralyzed by indecision, his hand still on my wrist, and I could practically hear his mind racing through options, through scenarios, through calculations of risk versus reward. And in my pocket, pressed against my hip, the voice recorder captured all of it. His labored breathing, his whispered prayers, his desperate attempts to wake me, his reluctance to call for help. Every second of audio was another nail in the coffin he'd built for himself. I waited, patient, still, because I'd learned something in 3 months of carrying that recorder, in 7 years of surviving his abuse, in 28 years of being Kenneth Hartley's daughter. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is absolutely nothing at all. I opened my eyes when he started to stand up, when his weight was shifting backward and he was preparing to finally make that call to 911, and the timing was perfect because he was mid-movement, off balance, and the shock of seeing me suddenly conscious made him stumble backward onto the stairs. Our eyes met across 3 feet of basement air, and I watched his face cycle through emotions faster than I could name them: relief, confusion, anger, fear, and then something darker, something that looked like betrayal, as if I'd tricked him by not actually being dead. "You're awake," he said, and it came out accusatory, like I'd committed some crime by regaining consciousness. "How long have you been awake?" I didn't answer immediately. Just pushed myself up slowly, carefully, my left arm protesting the movement but supporting my weight anyway. Blood had dried on my face, and I could feel it crack and flake as I moved, could taste the copper residue on my lips. My hair was wet from the water he'd thrown on me, plastered to my skull, and I probably looked like something from a horror movie, battered and bloody, and rising from the concrete like a ghost refusing to stay buried. I sat there on that cold floor with my back against the storage boxes, and I looked at my father, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. He was 56 years old, but in the harsh light from the kitchen, he looked ancient, his face gray and slack, his eyes red-rimmed like he'd been crying or was about to start. His work shirt was untucked, his hair mussed from where he'd been gripping it, and he'd shrunk somehow, diminished by the realization of what he'd done. "The whole time," I said finally, my voice coming out hoarse and strange. "I've been awake the whole time, Dad. He absorbed that information slowly, and I watched him process what it meant, watched his mind replay the last however many minutes of him panicking and checking my pulse and begging me to wake up. "You were faking," he said, and anger started creeping back into his voice, that familiar edge that meant he was about to turn this around, make me the villain. "You were playing dead to scare me." My hand went to my pocket, and I felt the recorder there, still warm, still running, and I wrapped my fingers around it like a talisman. This was the moment. Everything I'd planned for 3 months had led to this conversation in this basement, and I had to get it right because I'd only get one chance. Is this justice or just survival? I'd asked myself that question lying on the floor in the dark, and sitting here now looking at my father's face, I still didn't have a clean answer. Maybe it was both. Maybe survival was its own form of justice when you've been denied every other kind. "You pushed me," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You screamed at me and you pushed me down 15 stairs, and then you locked me in the dark and left me here." His jaw tightened. "You were being disrespectful." "You talked back and I—" "Stop," I interrupted, and the word came out harder than I'd meant it to, echoing in the basement. "Just stop. No more excuses. No more explanations about what I did to deserve it or what you were trying to teach me. You pushed your daughter down concrete stairs hard enough that I thought for a second I might actually die, and you know what the scariest part was?" His hands curled into fists at his sides, and I saw him fighting the urge to escalate, to make this my fault like he always did. But something in my face must have stopped him because he stayed silent, stayed on those stairs, waiting. "The scariest part," I continued, "was that I wasn't surprised. I've been waiting for this moment for 7 years, waiting for the time when your anger finally went too far and I ended up in a hospital, or worse. Mom knew it was coming. That's why she left. That's why she wrote me that note telling me your rage would destroy me too. And she was right, Dad. Your rage did destroy me. It destroyed the person I used to be, the daughter who loved you, the girl who thought her father hung the moon. That Rachel died a long time ago. The one sitting here now is just someone who learned how to survive you." I pulled the recorder out of my pocket then, held it up so he could see it clearly in the light from upstairs, and I pressed the button to stop the recording. The tiny beep it made was absurdly loud in the silence that followed, and I watched his eyes go from my face to the device and back again, watched him understand what it meant. "What is that?" he said, but it wasn't really a question. He knew. "A voice recorder," I answered anyway. "I bought it 3 months ago, and I've been carrying it every day since, waiting for you to give me what I needed. Congratulations, Dad. Tonight you gave me everything." His face went white. "You've been recording me? For 3 months. Not just tonight. For 3 months. Every argument. Every threat. Every time you laid hands on me. I have hours of audio documenting exactly who you are when nobody else is watching. The walls you've built around yourself. All those years of being the respectable Kenneth Hartley at work and in the neighborhood, they're about to come down because I have proof now. Not my word against yours. Not bruises that fade. Actual evidence that no one can dispute." He moved down a step, his hand reaching out like he was going to grab the recorder from me, and I stood up fast despite the pain screaming through my ribs, held the device above my head. "Don't," I said, and my voice had steel in it I didn't recognize. "Don't you dare touch me again. Don't you dare touch this recorder. Because if you do, if you take one more step toward me, I swear I will scream so loud every neighbor on Maple Street will come running, and then we'll have witnesses to add to the recording." His hand dropped. "You can't," he started, then stopped. "Can't what? Can't report you? Can't show people what you've been doing to me since I was 17? Watch me." His face crumpled then, actually crumpled, and he sat down hard on the stairs like his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. "Rachel, please," he said, and there was that word again, please, the one he never used. "You don't understand what this will do. I'll lose my job, my reputation, everything I've built." I held the recorder against my chest, felt it warm through my shirt, and something inside me that had been locked tight for years finally loosened. "You should have thought about that before you pushed me down the stairs," I said quietly. "You should have thought about that 7 years ago when you first hit me hard enough to leave a mark. You should have thought about it when Mom left and you had a chance to change, to be better, to realize that control isn't the same thing as love. But you didn't. You just kept going, kept hurting me, kept telling yourself I deserved it. And now the bill has come due. Is this justice or just survival? Maybe the question was irrelevant. Maybe they were the same thing after all. Maybe justice was just the word we used when survival required other people to face consequences for the harm they'd caused. I looked at my father sitting on those stairs, diminished and desperate, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Sadness. Not for him, exactly, but for us, for the family we could have been if he'd been capable of choosing differently. For the relationship that died somewhere between my 17th birthday and tonight, buried under years of fear and violence and his pathological need for control. But sadness wasn't going to stop me from doing what came next. Sadness didn't erase the bruises, or the broken dishes, or the 7 years of terror. Sadness was just the soundtrack playing while I finally took my power back. I'm calling 911 now, I told him, pulling my phone from where it had skittered under the stairs. You can sit there, or you can go upstairs, but either way the police are coming, and you're going to explain to them how your daughter ended up at the bottom of your basement with blood on her face and a recording of you pushing her. And after that, I'm leaving. I'm taking this recorder, and I'm walking out of this house, and I'm never coming back, and you can live with what you've done for the rest of your life. My thumb hovered over the emergency call button, and I looked at him one last time. Any last words, Dad? Anything you want to say that might actually matter? He stared at me with eyes that were finally seeing me as something other than property to control, and he opened his mouth like he might apologize, might take responsibility, might offer some explanation that would make sense of all this pain. But what came out was, "You don't know what you're doing." And that's when I knew for certain I was making the right choice. Because even now, even caught and cornered and facing consequences, Kenneth Hartley still couldn't admit he was wrong. Still couldn't see me as anything but a disobedient daughter who needed to be corrected. Still couldn't understand that respect earned through fear isn't respect at all. I pressed the button and lifted the phone to my ear, and the last thing I saw before I turned away from him was his face collapsing into the realization that his rage had finally caught up with him, and the daughter he'd spent years breaking had been strong enough all along to hold on to the pieces until she could use them as evidence. The 911 operator answered on the second ring, a woman's voice, calm and professional, asking me what my emergency was, and I realized I'd never actually planned what I'd say in this moment. All those weeks of preparation, and I'd focused on the recording, on the confrontation, but not on this part where I had to speak the truth out loud to a stranger. My father was still sitting on the stairs watching me, his face a mask of barely controlled panic, and when I opened my mouth to speak he stood up fast and hissed, "Don't you dare," but I'd already started talking. "I need help," I said into the phone, and my voice cracked on the word help, all the adrenaline that had kept me steady finally giving way to the reality of what I was doing. My father pushed me down the basement stairs and I'm hurt. There's blood and I think I might have hit my head and I need someone to come. The operator's voice shifted, became more urgent, and I heard keyboard clicks in the background as she pulled up my address. "Are you safe right now? Is your father still in the house?" I looked at him standing there, and he was shaking his head violently, mouthing the word no over and over, his hands up in a pleading gesture that would have been comical if it wasn't so pathetic. "He's here," I said. "He's in the basement with me. Can you get to a safe location? Can you leave the house?" "I could," I answered, already moving toward the stairs, watching him back up as I approached. "I'm leaving right now. Stay on the line with me," the operator instructed, and I could hear her typing faster, talking to someone else in the background, dispatching units. "I need you to tell me your name and confirm your address." "Rachel Hartley," I said, and I rattled off the Maple Street address while climbing those stairs past my father, who'd pressed himself against the railing to let me pass like I was something dangerous he didn't want to touch. The recorder was still in my left hand, held tight against my ribs, and my phone was in my right, pressed to my ear, and I felt like I was carrying everything that mattered in those two devices. Evidence and escape. Proof and protection. I reached the top of the stairs, and the kitchen light was harsh after the basement darkness, making me squint and realize how much my head actually hurt. The room swayed slightly, and I grabbed the counter for balance, took a breath, kept moving toward the front door. Behind me I heard my father's footsteps following, heavy and slow, and the operator must have heard them too, because she asked if he was following me and I said yes. "He's right behind me, but I'm almost outside." "Rachel," my father said, and his voice had that commanding tone he used when he expected obedience, when he thought he could still control the situation through sheer force of authority. "Rachel, stop. Put down the phone. We can handle this ourselves. We don't need police involved." The operator heard that. "Ma'am, are you in immediate danger? Does he have weapons?" "No weapons," I said, reaching the front door, fumbling with a deadbolt that my shaking hands couldn't quite grip properly. "Just fists. Just rage. Just 7 years of making me afraid to exist in my own home." The lock finally turned and I pulled the door open, and the March night air hit me like a baptism, cold and sharp and clean, nothing like the stale basement atmosphere I'd been breathing. I stumbled out onto the porch and down the steps to the driveway, putting distance between myself and the house, and I heard my father stop at the doorway, not following me outside where neighbors might see. "Rachel," he called from the doorframe, silhouetted against the kitchen light. "Please, don't do this. Think about what you're doing." I turned to look at him, and even across 20 feet of driveway I could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he was already constructing his defense, his explanation, his version of events where I was dramatic or unstable or somehow at fault. And I realized that some people never change, never take responsibility, never look in the mirror and see their own monstrousness reflected back. They just recalibrate their lies and try to sell them to the next audience. "Ma'am, are you outside now?" The operator's voice pulled me back. "Yes," I said. "I'm in the driveway." "He's still inside." "Good," she said. "Officers are approximately 3 minutes away. I need you to stay on the line until they arrive. Can you tell me about your injuries?" I did a mental inventory, touching my face gently and feeling the crusty dried blood around my nose and mouth. "Bleeding from my nose," I said. "Maybe a concussion. I hit my head on the wall going down. My ribs hurt in my arm. But I'm conscious and I can walk, so nothing's broken, I don't think." The operator asked if I needed an ambulance and I said yes. Better to have paramedics check everything. Better to have medical documentation. Better to have one more layer of official record showing what Kenneth Hartley had done to his daughter on this March night. In the distance I heard sirens, faint at first then growing louder, and my father heard them too because he stepped out onto the porch, his face stricken. "They're coming," I told him across the driveway, and I held up the recorder so he could see it. "They're coming, and I have evidence, and nothing you say is going to change what happens next." "You're going to ruin my life," he said, and there was still anger in it, still that edge of indignation like I was the one committing an offense by reporting what he'd done. "Over what? Over discipline? Over me trying to teach you respect?" The sirens were getting closer, maybe 2 blocks away now, and I could see lights starting to come on in neighboring houses, people waking up or looking out windows to see what the commotion was about. Mrs. Chun from next door appeared on her porch in a bathrobe, her elderly face creased with concern. "No, Dad," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. "Not over discipline. Not over teaching respect. Over 7 years of abuse. Over pushing me down 15 stairs. Over making me so afraid in my own home that I had to secretly record you just to prove to myself I wasn't crazy." 2 police cars turned onto Maple Street, their lights painting the neighborhood blue and red, and I watched my father's face as he realized this was really happening, that the carefully constructed life he'd built was about to be examined by people who wouldn't buy his charm or his excuses. The first officer was out of his car before it fully stopped, a young guy with kind eyes who approached me with his hands visible, non-threatening, asking if I was Rachel Hartley and if I was the one who called 911. "Yes," I said, and my legs suddenly felt weak, all the adrenaline that had kept me upright starting to drain away now that help had arrived. My father pushed me down the basement stairs. "I have injuries, and I have a voice recording of the whole thing." The officer's attention shifted to the porch where my father stood, and a second officer was already moving in that direction, hand near his belt, calling out for Kenneth Hartley to step down from the porch with his hands visible. I watched it unfold like a movie. My father complying slowly, being asked to turn around, being told to put his hands behind his back, and the look of absolute shock and humiliation on his face when the handcuffs clicked shut. An ambulance pulled up with its lights off but engine running, and a female paramedic was suddenly at my elbow, guiding me to sit on the back bumper, shining a pen light in my eyes to check my pupils, asking me questions about my pain level and whether I'd lost consciousness. The recorder was still in my hand, and I held it out to the first officer who'd approached me, a detective named Morrison, who'd arrived in an unmarked car right behind the ambulance. "This is 3 months of recordings," I told him. "Tonight's incident is the most recent one, but there are dozens more. Verbal abuse, threats, other physical incidents. Everything documented." Detective Morrison took the recorder carefully, like it was made of glass, and asked if I'd be willing to make a statement. "Tonight if possible, tomorrow at the latest, while everything was fresh." "Yes," I said. "Yes to everything. Whatever you need." Across the driveway, my father was being loaded into the back of a police car, and he was looking at me through the window with an expression I couldn't quite read. Anger, yes. Betrayal, definitely. But also something that might have been fear, or might have been the first glimmer of understanding that actions have consequences, and he'd spent years pretending they didn't. Mrs. Chun had come down from her porch and was standing a respectful distance away, her hand over her mouth. And when our eyes met, she mouthed, "Are you okay?" I nodded, because I was battered and bloody and probably concussed, sitting on an ambulance bumper at midnight while my father got arrested and neighbors gathered to watch. But I was okay in a way I hadn't been in 7 years. The paramedic was cleaning the blood from my face with antiseptic wipes that stung, telling me I'd need a CT scan to rule out serious head injury, asking if I had someone who could stay with me tonight because she wouldn't recommend being alone. I thought about my empty apartment that I'd fled months ago to move back into this house of horrors, and I realized I could go there tonight, could reclaim that space, could sleep in a bed without listening for footsteps in the hallway. "I have somewhere," I told her. "I'll be fine." And sitting there with half the neighborhood watching and police lights strobing across the familiar houses of Maple Street, I meant it. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I actually meant it when I said I'd be fine. They took me to Akron General Hospital, where Dr. Martinez with tired eyes and gentle hands checked me over in a bright examination room that smelled like antiseptic and floor wax. "Mild concussion," he confirmed after reviewing the CT scan. 2 cracked ribs, multiple contusions, severe bruising. He asked if I wanted to file for a protective order, and I said yes before he'd even finished the question. A hospital social worker named Denise appeared with paperwork and kind words, and she sat with me for an hour while I gave my initial statement, while nurses photographed my injuries from 6 different angles, while the reality of what I'd set in motion began to crystallize. My father spent that night in county lockup. I know because Detective Morrison called me the next morning to tell me Kenneth Hartley had been processed and charged with felonious assault, that the prosecutor's office was very interested in my case, given the recording evidence, that I should expect a call about testifying before a grand jury. But first, Morrison said, they wanted to interview my father with the recordings present, to see if confronting him with audio evidence would produce a confession or at least an explanation that didn't involve lying. Would I be willing to come down to the station and observe through the one-way glass? I went. 2 days after the basement, with my ribs taped and my face still showing yellow-green bruises, I walked into the Akron Police Department and let Detective Morrison lead me to a small observation room that looked into Interrogation Room 3. My father was already seated at the metal table inside, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made him look smaller somehow, diminished. His hands were cuffed to a ring bolted in the table's center, and he kept looking at the mirror, not knowing I was on the other side but probably suspecting it. A public defender sat next to him, a young woman with a briefcase who looked fresh out of law school and completely overwhelmed. Detective Morrison entered the interrogation room with a female officer I didn't know, and they went through the preliminaries. Date, time, everyone present, Miranda rights already read. Then Morrison set my voice recorder on the table between them, and I watched my father's eyes fix on it like it was a snake coiled to strike. "Mr. Hartley," Morrison began, "we've had a chance to listen to some of the recordings your daughter made over the past 3 months. I'd like to play a few excerpts and give you an opportunity to explain what we're hearing." My father's jaw tightened. I don't have anything to say without understanding the context. These recordings were made without my knowledge or consent. In my own home. That's illegal. Actually, Morrison said mildly, Ohio is a one-party consent state, which means only one person in a conversation needs to know it's being recorded. Your daughter was well within her legal rights. The public defender whispered something to my father that made him sit back in his chair, arms crossed as much as the cuffs allowed. Morrison pressed play on the recorder, and suddenly the small interrogation room, filled with my father's voice from 6 weeks ago, A Tuesday night argument about dinner. You're pathetic, Rachel. 28 years old, and you can't even cook a simple meal without screwing it up. What man is ever going to want you when you can't even manage basic household tasks? You're useless. A burden. I should have never let you move back after your mother abandoned us. The recording continued for another minute, his voice getting louder, more cruel, and through the glass I watched my father's face as he listened to himself. He'd gone pale, and his eyes kept darting to Morrison, to his lawyer, to the mirror where I stood hidden. That's not, he started, then stopped. That's taken out of context. She burned the chicken. I was frustrated. Morrison stopped the recording. Let's try another one, he said, and queued up an audio file from 8 weeks prior. This time it was the sound of breaking glass, my father shouting about a package I'd signed for that was supposed to go to a neighbor, and then a thud that I remembered was him shoving me against the refrigerator hard enough to leave a bruise shaped like the door handle. My voice in the recording, small and scared. I'm sorry. Dad, I'll take it over right now, I'm sorry. His voice, cold and measured. Sorry doesn't fix stupidity, Rachel. How many times do I have to teach you to pay attention? Maybe if I knock some sense into that empty head of yours, you'd finally learn. Another thud. My gasp of pain. Morrison let it play for 30 seconds of heavy breathing and my whispered crying before clicking it off. Would you like to provide context for that one, Mr. Hartley? My father's hands had curled into fists on the table. She's dramatic, he said. Always has been. She exaggerates everything, makes mountains out of molehills. This is what? A father disciplining his adult daughter who lives in his house rent-free. Since when is that a crime? His lawyer winced but said nothing, probably realizing her client was digging himself deeper with every word. Morrison played a third recording, this one from 2 months ago, and it was worse than the previous ones because you could hear my father chasing me through the house, his footsteps thundering, my panicked breathing as I tried to get to my bedroom and lock the door. You don't walk away from me when I'm talking to you, his voice screamed in the playback. You don't disrespect me in my own house. The sound of my bedroom door slamming, then his fists pounding on it, the wood rattling in the frame. Open this door right now, or I'll break it down, and you'll pay for the replacement. You hear me? You'll pay for everything, you ungrateful little bitch. Silence on the recording after that, just my ragged breathing on the other side of the door and my father's heavy footsteps retreating. Morrison stopped the playback and looked at Kenneth Hartley with an expression that managed to be both professional and deeply disgusted. We have 23 recordings like this, he said. 23 separate incidents spanning 3 months where your daughter documented verbal abuse, threats, and physical violence. And that's not even counting the basement incident from 2 nights ago, which we have in full. Your voice screaming at her. The sound of her body hitting stairs. 15 distinct impacts. Her labored breathing at the bottom while you locked her in the dark. And then your panic when you thought you'd killed her. My father was shaking his head, still trying to find an angle, still looking for a way to make this someone else's fault. She set me up, he said, and there was desperation in his voice now, the sound of a man watching his life collapse in real time. Don't you see? She bought that recorder specifically to trap me. She was planning this whole thing, probably for months. Waited for me to lose my temper so she could call the police and ruin my life. This is entrapment. The public defender put her hand on his arm, trying to get him to stop talking, but he shook her off. His eyes were fixed on the mirror now, and I knew he was talking to me, wherever he thought I might be. Rachel, he said, addressing his reflection. If you're listening, you need to understand what you're doing to me. I gave you everything. A roof over your head, food on the table, tried to teach you right from wrong. And this is how you repay me. By recording me without permission? By making me look like some kind of monster? Through the glass I watched him and felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no vindicación. Just a kind of empty recognition that this man genuinely believed he was the victim here, that even faced with hours of audio evidence of his own cruelty, he couldn't see himself clearly. Couldn't understand that discipline and abuse aren't the same thing, that control and love are not synonyms, that a father who terrifies his daughter has failed at the most basic requirement of parenthood. Detective Morrison gathered up the recorder. Mr. Hartley, I'm going to be straight with you. The prosecutor has all 23 recordings, plus the basement incident. They have hospital records documenting your daughter's injuries. They have testimony from neighbors who've heard shouting from your house over the years. And they have a victim who's coherent, credible, and very clearly not making this up. You can continue to claim you're being persecuted, or you can take responsibility for what you've done. Either way, you're looking at serious prison time. My father slumped in his chair, the fight going out of him all at once, and when he spoke again his voice was barely above a whisper. I never meant, he started, then couldn't seem to finish the sentence. Never meant what? To hurt me? To scare me? To spend 7 years making me wish I was anywhere but in his house? The words hung unfinished in the air and Morrison stood up, signaling the interview was over. We'll give you some time to talk with your attorney, he said. But Mr. Hartley, your daughter didn't set you up. She documented reality. There's a difference. Morrison left the interrogation room and a moment later appeared in the observation room where I stood. You okay? He asked, and I realized I was crying, tears running down my face that I hadn't even felt coming. I nodded, unable to speak, because watching my father finally hear himself, finally confront the evidence of who he really was, should have felt like victory, but instead it just felt like grief. Grief for the father I'd wanted him to be. Grief for the daughter I could have been if he'd chosen differently. Grief for all the years we'd wasted in this terrible dance of control and survival. But underneath the grief was something else, something solid and unshakable, the knowledge that I'd done the right thing. That documenting abuse and reporting it and refusing to protect an abuser from consequences wasn't betrayal. It was survival. It was justice. It was me finally choosing myself over his comfort. Morrison offered me a tissue and I took it, wiped my face, and looked one last time through the glass at Kenneth Hartley sitting in his orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed to a table. He looked small, defeated. The full accounting of what those 7 years cost me came out slowly, in pieces, during the weeks and months after that night in the basement. Detective Morrison needed details for the prosecution, and my therapist needed context for the trauma, and somewhere in between their questions I started to see the shape of what I'd lost, what I'd sacrificed, what I'd given up to survive in Kenneth Hartley's house. The numbers alone were staggering. 17 emergency room visits between age 21 and 28, only 3 of which I'd ever reported as domestic violence before giving up and using the slipped-in-the-shower excuse. Hospital bills totaling $43,000 that I'd paid out of pocket using credit cards I hid from my father, cards I was still paying minimum payments on with interest rates that would take me until age 40 to clear. Dr. Martinez asked me during a follow-up appointment why I'd never used my father's insurance, and I'd laughed bitterly because using his insurance would have meant him seeing the bills, seeing the frequency, having to explain to his HR department why his adult daughter was in the ER twice a month. Easier to destroy my credit than risk his questions. There was the job at the counseling center I'd turned down when I was 24. They'd wanted to hire me as an intake coordinator, $45,000 a year with benefits, a foot in the door for the psychology career I'd always dreamed about. But the hours were evening shift, 6 p.m. to midnight, which meant I wouldn't be home to cook my father's dinner or clean up after him or be available for whatever he decided he needed. I told them I couldn't accept the position, made up an excuse about scheduling conflicts, and I'd watched the hiring manager's face fall with disappointment because she'd really believed I'd be good at the work. I'd cried in my car for an hour after that meeting, mourning the version of myself who could have taken that job, built that career, maybe even found purpose in helping people navigate their own trauma while I swallowed mine. 6 years later, I was still working at the diner for $12 an hour plus tips. There were the friends who'd stopped calling. Marissa from high school, who'd invited me to her wedding in Columbus when I was 23, and I'd RSVP'd yes, but then didn't show up because my father had decided that weekend was when we were cleaning out the garage, and I wasn't allowed to leave until it was done. She texted me afterward, hurt and confused, asking what happened, and I'd lied and said I'd had the flu. She never invited me to anything again. Or Jake from community college, the sweet guy who'd asked me on 3 separate occasions to get coffee, who'd clearly liked me and who I'd liked back. But I'd said no every time because the thought of bringing someone into my life meant eventually having to explain my father, explain the bruises, explain why I flinched at raised voices. Jake stopped asking, started dating someone else, graduated and moved to Pittsburgh, and sometimes I'd see his photos on social media looking happy with his fiancée, and I'd wonder what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to say yes. The community college psychology degree I'd been working on for 6 years that should have taken 2. I'd failed classes not because I wasn't smart enough, but because I'd miss exams when my injuries were too visible to go to campus, or I'd skip assignments when my father had kept me up until 3 a.m. lecturing me about my failures. My GPA was 2.1 when it should have been 3.8, and every semester I'd sit through academic probation meetings with advisors who looked at me with concern and asked if everything was okay at home, and I'd smile and lie and say everything was fine, just having trouble balancing work and school. Nothing to worry about. Professor Chen, my intro to psychology teacher, had pulled me aside once after class when I'd shown up with a barely hidden black eye and finger-shaped bruises on my wrist. She'd asked me directly, no dancing around it, if someone was hurting me, and I'd felt the truth rising in my throat like bile, but I'd swallowed it back down and told her I'd been in a minor car accident, really clumsy parking, nothing serious. She'd held my gaze for a long moment, and then handed me a card for a domestic violence hotline and said if I ever needed help, day or night, I should call. I kept that card in my wallet for 2 years before finally throwing it away, because keeping it felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. There was the money I'd loaned my father that he'd never pay back, almost $15,000 over the years, always for emergencies that turned out to be him mismanaging his finances or impulsively buying tools he didn't need, or covering a gambling debt he'd accumulated at the Indian casino 2 towns over. I'd given him the money because saying no meant facing his rage, and it was easier to destroy my savings account than deal with what would happen if I refused. When I checked my balance the week after the basement incident, preparing to finally move into my own apartment, I'd had $832 to my name. $800 at age 28. Most people my age were saving for houses, starting retirement accounts, building actual adult lives. I was counting dollars and cents and calculating how many shifts I'd need at the diner to afford first and last month's rent. The therapy I desperately needed but couldn't afford, so instead I'd self-medicated with whatever I could find. Sleeping pills to quiet my mind, alcohol on my worst nights, dissociation as a survival skill I'd perfected to the point where I could be physically present in a room while mentally floating somewhere far away where fists and words couldn't reach me. My current therapist, Dr. Williams, diagnosed me with complex PTSD in our second session and asked me gently how I'd survived this long without professional help, and I'd told her the truth. I'd survived by not thinking about it too hard, by compartmentalizing, by telling myself that what didn't kill me made me stronger, even though I knew that wasn't how trauma actually worked. There were the little deaths, too, the ones that were harder to quantify but just as real. The death of believing my father loved me, which had happened gradually somewhere between age 17 and 21. The death of feeling safe anywhere, even in locked rooms, because I'd learned that locks could be removed and privacy was a privilege that could be revoked. The death of my ability to trust my own judgment, because I'd spent so many years being told I was wrong, stupid, oversensitive, dramatic, that I'd started to believe maybe I was the problem. Maybe I deserved what was happening. Maybe this was just what family looked like, and I was too weak to handle it. The death of believing I deserved good things, which manifested in me accepting crumbs from people and calling it a feast, in me staying small and quiet and grateful for any kindness because I'd been trained to expect cruelty as the baseline. During the trial preparation, the prosecutor asked me to make a list of everything the abuse had cost me, and I'd sat at my new apartment's kitchen table for 3 hours writing and rewriting, trying to capture 7 years of loss on paper. The final document was 11 pages long, single-spaced, and when I'd finished I'd sat there staring at it and realized I'd spent nearly a third of my life in survival mode, had sacrificed my 20s to my father's inability to control his rage, had given up dreams and opportunities and relationships and money and health and peace of mind. And for what? For the privilege of living in his house. For the honor of being Kenneth Hartley's daughter? The math didn't add up. It never had. But the most devastating cost, the one I hadn't fully understood until I was sitting in Dr. Williams' office talking through it, was the cost to my sense of self. I'd spent 7 years making myself smaller, quieter, less visible, molding myself into whatever shape might avoid his anger, and in doing so I'd lost track of who Rachel Hartley actually was underneath all the survival strategies. I didn't know what I liked anymore, what I wanted, what I believed in, because every preference and desire and opinion had been filtered through the question of whether it would upset him. I'd become a ghost in my own life, and the saddest part was I hadn't even noticed it happening until it was done. 7 years, 84 months, approximately 2,500 days of living in fear. The prosecution would eventually use all this information to paint a picture for the jury of sustained, systematic abuse, of a father who'd isolated and controlled and financially exploited his daughter while physically terrorizing her. But for me, making that list and seeing it all laid out chronologically was less about building a legal case and more about finally acknowledging to myself the magnitude of what I'd endured. Ide surviva. That was something. But survival had come at a price I was only beginning to calculate, and I knew the work of recovering from those 7 years would take at least 7 more, maybe a lifetime, of learning how to be a person again instead of just a target. The trial took place 9 months after the basement incident, in a Cleveland courtroom with high ceilings and wooden benches that creaked when people shifted in their seats. Kenneth Hartley had rejected the initial plea deal of 6 years, insisting on his innocence, claiming I'd manipulated the situation, that the recordings were taken out of context, that he was the real victim of a vindictive daughter who wanted to punish him for being a strict parent. So we went to trial, and I sat in the witness stand for 2 days telling my story to 12 strangers, while my father watched from the defense table with an expression that alternated between wounded betrayal and cold calculation. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Catherine Brooks who'd built her career on domestic violence cases, walked me through the timeline methodically. She played excerpts from the recordings, showed photographs of my injuries, brought in Dr. Martinez to testify about the pattern of trauma he documented. She called Mrs. Chun from next door, who testified she'd heard shouting and crashing sounds from our house for years but hadn't wanted to intrude on family business, a decision she now clearly regretted based on how she couldn't meet my eyes when she stepped down from the stand. The defense attorney tried to paint me as unstable, manipulative, someone who'd recorded her father secretly because I was looking for a payday or attention or revenge for normal parental discipline. But the recordings spoke for themselves, and when Brooks played the basement audio in full, you could hear people in the gallery inhale sharply at the sound of my body hitting those stairs. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they came back, the forewoman read the verdict in a steady voice. Guilty on all counts: felonious assault, unlawful imprisonment, multiple counts of domestic violence spanning years. My father's face went gray when he heard the word guilty, and his lawyer put a hand on his shoulder to steady him, but he shook her off and turned to look at me across the courtroom. I met his gaze and held it, and I wondered what he saw when he looked at me now. Not the terrified daughter he'd controlled for 7 years. Someone different, someone who'd survived him. The sentencing hearing was 3 weeks later. Judge Patricia Brennan, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and no patience for excuses, listened to the prosecution's recommendation of 12 to 15 years, then asked if my father wanted to make a statement before she decided. He stood up, and for a moment I thought he might finally apologize, might finally take real responsibility, but what came out was more deflection wrapped in self-pity. He talked about how hard he'd worked to provide for his family, how his daughter had lived in his house rent-free, how he'd only wanted to teach me discipline and respect. He said he'd never intended to hurt me seriously, that the basement incident had been an accident born of frustration, that he'd already lost everything that mattered: his job, his reputation, his freedom. He never once said I'm sorry, never once acknowledged that what he'd done was abuse, not discipline. Never once looked at me with anything resembling genuine remorse. Judge Brennan listened without expression, then delivered a sentencing statement that I'd later get a transcript of to read whenever I doubted myself. "Mr. Hartley," she said, "you stood before this court and claimed you only wanted to teach your daughter respect. But respect is not taught through terror. Discipline is not synonymous with violence. What you did to Rachel Hartley over 7 years was systematic abuse designed to maintain control, and the recordings she bravely documented show a pattern of escalating violence that could have ended in her death. You show no remorse, take no responsibility, and seem primarily concerned with your own losses rather than the trauma you inflicted. Therefore, I'm sentencing you to 14 years in the Ohio Department of Corrections, with eligibility for parole after serving 10. She brought her gavel down and it was over. My father was led away in handcuffs, and I sat in that courtroom feeling a complicated mix of relief and emptiness because justice had been served, but it didn't undo the damage, didn't give me back the years I'd lost, didn't magically heal the wounds that would probably take decades to fully process. In the months that followed, I learned what healing actually looked like, and it was messier than I'd expected. There were good days where I'd wake up in my small one-bedroom apartment and feel genuinely safe for the first time in memory, where I'd eat breakfast without calculating whether the eggs were cooked properly enough to avoid criticism, where I'd go through an entire day without flinching at sudden movements or raised voices. And there were bad days where I'd have panic attacks in grocery stores because someone yelled at their kid, where I'd lie awake at 3 a.m. convinced I'd made a mistake by reporting him, where I'd Google his prison ID number just to reassure myself he was really locked up and couldn't get to me. Dr. Williams taught me that recovery wasn't linear. Taught me that I could acknowledge the loss of what could have been, the father-daughter relationship I'd wanted, while also holding firm to the truth that I'd done the right thing by stopping the abuse. Taught me that I deserved safety, deserved kindness, deserved to take up space in the world without apologizing for existing. Those lessons were harder to learn than any college course I'd ever taken, required more courage than carrying that recorder for 3 months, because they meant fundamentally rewiring how I thought about myself. I went back to community college and finished my psychology degree, this time with a 3.9 GPA because I wasn't missing classes to hide injuries. I got the job at the counseling center I'd turned down years ago, a different position but same organization, and found purpose in helping other domestic violence survivors navigate the legal and emotional aftermath of leaving abusive situations. I became the person I'd needed when I was 21 and terrified and didn't know where to turn. I started dating again, carefully, learning how to recognize healthy relationships versus ones that mirrored the control patterns I'd grown up with. There were false starts and mistakes, guys who seemed nice but turned out to have their own issues with anger or control, but eventually I learned to trust my instincts, to walk away at the first red flag, to understand that being alone was better than being afraid. 2 years after the trial, I received a letter from my father. It had been forwarded through the prison system, and my lawyer had reviewed it first to make sure it wasn't threatening. When I finally opened it, sitting at my kitchen table with Dr. Williams on speed dial just in case, I found 3 handwritten pages that surprised me. He didn't fully apologize, didn't take complete responsibility, but for the first time, he acknowledged that he'd been wrong, that his actions had been abuse, not discipline, that he damaged me in ways he was only beginning to understand now that he'd been forced to attend anger management and trauma therapy as part of his prison program. He said he understood if I never wanted to see him again, that he didn't deserve my forgiveness, but that he wanted me to know he was trying to become someone different, someone better, someone who could look at himself honestly even when the reflection was ugly. I read that letter 5 times, and each time I felt a different emotion: anger, sadness, relief, grief, and finally something close to peace. Not forgiveness, exactly. I wasn't sure I'd ever fully forgive him for stealing 7 years of my life, for making me afraid in my own home, for choosing violence over love so consistently and for so long. But I could acknowledge that he was trying, and that was more than I'd expected. I didn't write back. Maybe someday I would. Maybe when I was 40 or 50 and had enough distance and healing to engage with him without it costing me my peace. Or maybe I never would, and that was okay too. The lesson I'd learned wasn't about him at all. It was about me. I learned that I deserved safety, that my worth wasn't determined by his approval or anyone else's, that survival was an achievement worth celebrating even when the survival itself was ugly and painful and left scars. I learned that documenting abuse wasn't betrayal, that reporting it wasn't weakness, that choosing myself over protecting an abuser from consequences was one of the bravest things I'd ever done. And I learned that healing was possible even from trauma that felt insurmountable, even when the person who hurt you was someone who was supposed to protect you. As for what my father learned, I could only guess based on that letter and the reports I'd gotten from his prison counselor through the Victim Services Program. He learned, or was beginning to learn, that actions have consequences, that rage destroys everything it touches, that control is just fear wearing a mask of authority. He learned that the daughter he'd tried to break was stronger than he'd given her credit for, that documentation and evidence could dismantle a carefully constructed life, that respect earned through fear isn't respect at all. Whether those lessons would stick, whether he'd emerge from prison a changed man or just a more careful abuser, I didn't know and wasn't responsible for finding out. My job was to heal myself, not fix him. My responsibility was to build a life worth living, not to manage his rehabilitation. And slowly, day by day, therapy session by therapy session, I was doing exactly that. 5 years after that night in the basement, I stood in front of a community center auditorium in Toledo, giving a talk about recognizing the signs of domestic abuse, and a woman in the third row raised her hand and asked me the question I'd been asked 100 times before. Why did it take you so long to leave? I looked at her and saw my younger self reflected back. That mixture of genuine curiosity and underlying judgment, the question that implies leaving should be easy, should be obvious, should happen the first time someone crosses a line. And I gave her the answer I'd learned to give, the one that was true even if it was uncomfortable, because leaving isn't a moment, it's a process, and sometimes survival means staying until you're strong enough to go. The truth that I wish someone had told me when I was 21 is that abuse doesn't announce itself with sirens and flashing lights. It doesn't show up wearing a sign that says I'm going to hurt you. It comes disguised as love, as protection, as discipline, as someone who just cares too much or wants what's best for you or is trying to make you a better person. It starts small, criticism wrapped in concern, control packaged as caring, isolation presented as intimacy. By the time you realize you're in danger, you've already been trained to doubt your own perception, to question whether what you're experiencing is really that bad, to wonder if maybe you're the problem after all. What silence are we carrying that needs to be heard? That's the question I ask audiences now, and I watch people shift in their seats, uncomfortable with the implications. Because the silence isn't always dramatic. It's not always basement stairs and cracked ribs and blood on concrete floors. Sometimes it's quieter than that. It's the relationship where you're constantly walking on eggshells, where you've learned to predict someone's moods and adjust your behavior accordingly, where apologizing for things that aren't your fault has become your default response to conflict. It's the family dynamic where one person's anger controls everyone else's behavior, where children learn to make themselves small and quiet, where love feels conditional on perfect obedience. It's the friendship where you give and never receive, where criticism is constant but support is rare, where you've started to believe that being treated poorly is better than being alone. That silence, the one we carry in our bodies and our habits and our learned responses to conflict, that's what needs to be heard. Not just by others, but by ourselves. We need to hear our own silence and ask what it's protecting us from, and whether the protection is worth the price we're paying. I learned that lesson on a basement floor at age 28, but I wish I'd learned it at 17 when the first real blow landed, or at 21 when my mother left and I chose to stay, or at 24 when I turned down that job because I was too afraid to live my own life. I wish someone had told me that recognizing abuse doesn't make you weak or dramatic or oversensitive. It makes you aware, and awareness is the first step toward change. The courage we all carry isn't the courage to be fearless. It's the courage to be afraid and take action anyway, to recognize when something is wrong even when everyone around you is pretending it's normal, to trust your own experience even when you've been trained to doubt it. For me, that courage looked like buying a voice recorder in a Best Buy and carrying it in my pocket for 3 months. For someone else it might look like calling a hotline, or telling a friend, or going to therapy, or simply admitting out loud that what's happening to them isn't okay. Courage isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just the quiet decision to stop protecting someone else at the expense of yourself. If you're reading this story and seeing pieces of your own life reflected back, I want you to know something. You're not crazy, you're not making it up, and you're not alone. The fact that you're recognizing the patterns, that you're questioning whether what you're experiencing is normal, that you're searching for validation that your fear is justified, that itself is progress. That's the beginning of your voice recorder moment, whatever form that takes for you. And if you're reading this story and thinking, thank God that's not me, that I'm nothing like Rachel, that my situation is completely different, I'd ask you to sit with that discomfort for a moment and really examine it. Because abuse thrives on our ability to convince ourselves it's not that bad, not like what other people go through, not worthy of the label we've reserved for situations worse than our own. But pain is pain, and abuse is abuse, and you don't need to wait until you're at the bottom of the stairs before you're allowed to say this isn't okay. The recording I made that night has been used in training seminars for police officers, in college courses about domestic violence, in support groups for survivors who need to hear that documentation and evidence and speaking up actually works sometimes. But the real legacy of that recording isn't the legal outcome or the educational value. It's the lesson I learned about my own worth, about the power of refusing to stay silent, about the strength it takes to choose yourself when you've spent years being told you don't matter. 5 years later, I'm 33 years old. I have a master's degree in clinical psychology that I earned while working full-time in processing trauma and therapy. I run a support group for domestic abuse survivors at the counseling center where I work, and I see my younger self in every woman who walks through the door convinced she's the only one who's ever felt this afraid, this confused, this trapped. I tell them what I learned, that leaving is possible, that healing is real, that the courage you need is already inside you even if you can't feel it yet, and that choosing safety over someone else's comfort is not betrayal, it's survival, and survival is worth fighting for. My father is still in prison. He'll be eligible for parole in 5 years, and when that time comes I'll have to decide whether to appear at his hearing, whether to tell the parole board about the nightmares I still have sometimes, the hypervigilance that probably won't ever fully go away, the years of my life I lost to his inability to control his rage. I don't know yet what I'll decide. What I do know is that I'm no longer that terrified 28-year-old lying on a basement floor hoping her plan would work. I'm someone who survived, who documented, who testified, who built a life on the other side of trauma that's messy and imperfect but undeniably mine. And that's worth everything. If after hearing Rachel's story you feel there's someone in your family you haven't truly seen, or if you recognize patterns in your own life that mirror what she experienced, don't wait 7 years like she did. Don't wait until you're at the bottom of the stairs. Tell me in the comments, what silence are you carrying that needs to be heard? Is there someone in your life whose worth you've underestimated, or maybe someone who's underestimated yours? And don't forget to tell me what city you're watching from. I love knowing where my survivors and supporters are located around the world, because this story isn't just about Rachel. It's about all of us learning to recognize abuse, to value our own safety, to understand that respect isn't earned through fear and love should never feel like terror. Sometimes the most valuable person is the one who seems invisible, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to stay silent anymore. Don't forget to subscribe, because Rachel's story is just one of hundreds I'll be sharing about daughters and fathers and the complicated mathematics of family and survival. Your worth isn't determined by someone else's ability to see it. Remember that. And if you need help, reach out. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233, available 24/7, because you deserve safety, and no one should have to carry their silence alone.